Hello friends, my name is Keisha, and I'm a proud member of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. I'm also a survivor of human trafficking. My trafficking began in Canada and crossed into the United States. I was stalked, hunted, and ignored by the very systems that were meant to protect me. This is why, with my father, Dale Richardson, we started the Karis Project, an Indigenous survivor-led movement for humanity. We are dedicated to exposing human trafficking, government corruption, and holding institutions accountable. The judicial branch is broken. It has failed to restrain the evils that have come upon this republic. Whether it's family court failures, weaponization of the judiciary, COVID-era harms, or human trafficking, the courts have allowed these issues to continue unchecked for too long. One of the most powerful tools we're using is the petition for redress of grievances. These are lawful constitutional actions rooted in the founding principles of this country. On May 19, 2026, a formal petition for redress of grievances was submitted to the United States Congress. This petition is demanding that Congress and the President use the powers under Article 4, Section 4 to preserve this Republican form of government by restraining these abuses pending congressional investigation. Through the Karis Project Action Plan, we are mobilizing people across the United States to strengthen this effort. This petition has been created as a template. If you or someone you love have been hurt by these same systemic failures in the courts or by government institutions, your evidence matters. When you come forward, please bring your evidence along with a copy of the petition for redress of grievances. This helps connect your story to this growing constitutional record being placed before Congress. We are asking you to stand with us. Join the Karis Project Action Plan and help us build a precedent that demands accountability and protects the God-given rights of American families. Our united voices will compel Congress to uphold the Constitution and safeguard our liberties. United we stand, one nation under God. I will close with my favorite quote. The greatest want of the world is the want of men. Men who will not be bought or sold. Men who in their inmost souls are true and honest. Men who do not fear to call sin by its right name. Men whose conscience is as true to duty as the needle to the pole. Men who will stand for the right, though the heavens may fall. Thank you.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the Karis Project podcast. Sorry, I'm just a little bit off today. Yeah. So we're here to talk about some COVID origins here with Jon. Welcome to the show. You want to reintroduce yourself to our audience? For the first time.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Jon Fleetwood. I got my start with American faith. Coming out of college, I actually was focused on theology and getting into ministry, but then I saw inside of the Christian universities that cultural Marxism had seeped in, and I had multiple experiences. If you ever want to, talk about that, we could, revealing that even in Christian academics, top institutions. And, when you start following the Marxism trail, you end up getting to all this death. Dr. Norman Geisler approximates there were about 1 billion deaths with a B that can be connected to the horrors of communism, or at least that's what the history books tell us throughout the past century. And then when I realized that Marxist mentality, this sort of anti-Western mentality, had gotten into that has all these deaths linked to it. Pol Pot in Indochina, Stalin in Russia, Mao Zedong, Ceausescu, Hitler, Mussolini. All these left-wing ideologies end up leading to millions and millions of deaths.
Yes.
And when I saw that mentality in the universities, I realized, oh my gosh, I have to do something about this. I have to do something that merges, my love for God and truth with what's going on in politics. So I started a website reporting the news from that perspective with no hyperbole, no fake news, because the truth, as you know, is
Yes.
a lot stranger than fiction. So I was asked
Yes.
to come on at American Faith, be their managing editor. Uh, uh, got to have a team of writers under me and pick, the direction of the news stories. The significance of that is that was at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And
Okay.
my boss, I had the wonderful opportunity to be able to choose to set the editorial tone for a nonprofit news organization at the beginning of COVID, which was one that was very skeptical of government, because I knew about Operation LAC, large area coverage, where they sprayed zinc cadmium sulfide over Americans without our informed consent, linked to deaths and injuries. Operation Sea Spray, Operation Big Buzz, Big Itch, Operation Big City up in New York, where the government admits, or they claim, they released pathogens in the subway to see what they would do. Sea Spray over on the West Coast, of course, is one of the most popular ones, where they sprayed a bacteria called Serratia marcescens over Americans in over San Francisco, and that led to deaths and infections and whatnot. So I brought that kind of incredulity and skepticism and sort of watchdog accountability mindset to a news organization. And after I helped bring that up to millions of content impressions per month, and honed my skills, I realized I have a mission that is exposing what really went on during COVID. And that's what I've been applying to my website, jonfleetwood.com. If you go to jonfleetwood.com, it'll go to my Substack, and you'll see all of my reporting there that you're not going to get anywhere else.
Yes, we have the links in the description as well if you're watching on Rumble, or Facebook or YouTube. Yeah, so you mentioned a lot about them spraying a lot of stuff on people, which I mean tells you a lot about how they poison people and so forth, because it's easier to do it that way, especially in indoor spaces. This is one of the things that I looked at over and over again. And I mean, the people that we're dealing with, they're very criminal minded. You might look at them and they're wearing suits and they're
Yes.
sitting in office and stuff, but they're far worse than any like gang member or mafia person that you would think of sitting in a jail or on the street corner, right? They're far worse. And so people have to understand they're going to do as much evil as they possibly could. So when it came down to COVID, what started to basically trigger your spidey senses?
That's a good question. The push for a vaccine from the very beginning was a big one, and because that's always the end goal. And once we get into sort of the DARPA stuff, if we end up getting into that, the prophecy and diffuse and adept
Yes.
and P3 and preempt and
Yes.
all that, we can get more into that, where the entire end goal is a vaccine. And they state that explicitly. This isn't like my interpretation. I'm not inferring anything. These are you can
Yes.
put your own eyes on these documents and these BAAs that they put out, and they admit this. It's all about they call them countermeasures. So it could be monoclonal antibodies, it could be this drug, it could be that drug, but ultimately it's about getting a vaccine into us. That is the end goal. That's what it was always about. So that made me ask questions, that this really isn't about safety or curing. Things like getting fresh food, healthy food, was downplayed, or vitamins and minerals and how
Yes.
they might help was downplayed while they upplayed the drugs. So that was a big one. And then uh, they like I said, the government has a history of doing some very unspeakable things to Americans. You could talk. Everybody knows about Tuskegee, what they did to the airmen. Everybody less people know about. You got Bill Clinton coming out and doing a mea culpa, where he said, "Hey, yeah, we injected this irradiated material into Americans without their consent." And we all just forget about these things. But I mentioned all these are official operations. They have Wikipedia web pages, for crying out loud. I'm not making these up. This isn't a conspiracy, although the conspiracy theorists have been right. You have David Morins now coming out and admitting that he pled guilty to committing conspiracy to defraud. These are their words, not mine. Conspiracy to defraud Americans when it comes to COVID origins. And lo and behold, of course, Morens is connected to EcoHealth, which of course is connected to Diffuse, which is DARPA, which is somehow I always end up getting to DARPA. It's like all roads lead to DARPA, even though they're not the only one.
Yes.
But yeah, those were some of the main reasons that kept me skeptical from the beginning, was just knowing the Wikipedia level history of what the government does to us.
Yeah. So for me, like, I'm a mechanical engineering technologist in a bachelor of technology. So during the COVID response, I was tasked with, getting businesses, some dental clinics to comply with the reopening procedures, which included the HVAC infection controls. And so I was sitting down with like a professional engineer who his specialty was like dealing with hospitals and infection controls, and the HVAC systems in there, and a few other technologists. And we got the guidelines, and I'm like, this isn't going to work. Where's the rest of this? Because it mentioned the mixing factor, which is basically an efficiency, and the rest of it was gone. So I'm like, well, I can't do anything with this until I get the rest of the information. So somebody like me would understand this. But they were handing this out to the public, which was a problem. So anyway, we figured it out, what was going on. And I was like, well, this is critical because it would give like somebody who didn't know what they were doing to say, I don't understand this. So I need to find someone who does. And then I found evidence of like a plumber going in and doing it wrong. And I'm like, you have no idea whether this is going to work. And so what I said was the worst case scenario is you're going to have a bunch of unknown failures in an unknown number of systems that you cannot account for. And I said, this is how you could literally spread a biological weapon and make it look like a random outbreak, because you couldn't predict where that failures would be. You'd have a pretty good idea, but where they were occurring, it would seem random because you wouldn't know how effective the system was and whether or not it was working or not. And so when I saw this, I was just like, absolutely not. Right. And then when they brought in the vaccines and so forth, it even strengthened this, because it was just like, for what? Right. Because they're like, engineering controls is your first step of a pandemic response. Look at the hierarchy of controls. It's right there. It's very simple. And that's up to 80 to 90% of your infection controls would come from that. So if you wipe that off the board, then you're going to administrative controls, which they were doing wrong, and then going down to PP as your primary line of offense. That's just nonsense, right? Like, imagine if you were looking at some type of like heavy machinery and you expecting PPE to protect you from it, like a circular saw or something like that. That'd be nonsense, right? So,
right.
Yeah. So that tipped me off.
And even the mainstream was promoting the idea that it could have been a lab leak. So that was an open possibility even for the mainstream.
Well, yes. And kind of going back to the lab leak theory, because a lot of people don't look at what was happening in Canada. And actually, Fauci downplayed this when they came out, and Fauci basically put out that email to a bunch of people that had the Nature article that talked about Peter Daszak, and they mentioned the lab leak and just kind of relegated it along to like conspiracy theory. Well, what people don't realize is that in Canada, the Dr. Chu that was in that part of that, and then there was Dr. Keating, which is her husband, they were sending pathogens from Winnipeg to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Dr. Chu was promoted to be overseeing Project 1 and 2. So that's vaccine development and developing synthetic viruses, right? And they have two people that were from the Wuhan Institute of Virology named as Individual 1 and Individual 2. The only thing is that they were named in a paper that was the 2015 paper that was the reason why they paused the gain of function, which was Shi Zhengli and another person. But Individual 1 had to be Shi Zhengli because she was a senior scientist and an assistant director at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And Individual 2 was the technician who was doing the actual vaccine research and some of that stuff. And that guy was actually in Winnipeg trying to steal pathogens before they sent it, right? So you had the guys in Canada giving the technical know-how because they're like, they don't have this know-how, and they said that Dr. Chu was the one who had the most know-how for the BSL-4 procedures because she worked at the one in Winnipeg. And they were, and then when they put out the genomic profile, the Bangladesh strain of the Nipah virus was pretty much the same accession number is what was found in the genomic profile, and that came from Winnipeg.
Interesting.
Oh, yes.
So I'm so at the beginning of this, at the beginning of COVID, I was 100% in belief that there was this thing, there was a pathogen that was actually created. I'm starting to come to the position that I think it's more helpful for investigations to see how everything's connected. If we don't assume that the primary goal was to create a pathogen, but that the primary goal was to create a sequence, and if you start from there, then there's no then you have admissions and a paper trail that go back decades and decades that can help understand what's going on. And that's not to say that people didn't get sick or people don't get sick or that viruses don't exist. There's this whole deep, very difficult debate going on right now between the terrain theory group, who believe that illness is not something caused by pathogens per se, but it's more about your environment, hence the word terrain. It's about toxins in the foods and the air and the things that we drink, and then other types of exposure, and then natural detoxing processes where our body has these functions. I mean, everybody knows this of detoxifying, and that's what flu would be according to the terrain theory people. For the virology people, no, there are these things called viruses, and they're little pieces of biology that act on their own and do things and make us sick via infection. But those are two different camps where there's a very fascinating debate going on, especially on X right now. Dr. Tom Cowan is a good source to go to. Jamie Andrews is another good source. Who's the gal she's in Australia or New Zealand? I can't think of her name. Oh, Sam Bailey, Dr. Sam Bailey. She's another one. These are geniuses. Way me. And so I put those things together, and I start thinking about what's going on with this sequence. And I've done the blast analysis. I have article after article on my website where I've used the government's basic local alignment search tool to run either the entire SARS-CoV-2 genome or just the spike protein against other targets in the genome, and you find that they match HERV-K. They match a lot of different genetics inside the human genome even. But when you run the blast analysis, you can find SARS-CoV-2 in any animal, in birds and in bats, and it turns out you can do this for any pathogen. You can do it for influenza. So that got me on the genetic route to get really nitty gritty about the genetics of it, because that's what genetics is all about. You're down to the nucleotide level, G's and C's and T's and A's, or the amino acid level. And once you do that, you start finding out there are some really big questions here. There's a lot of inferences going on. And what really got me thinking, okay, I got to take this seriously, was the fact that no U.S. agency or any agency around the world ever confirmed the BALF fluid, the lung lavage fluid, from the alleged, first cases over there in China. Nobody ever confirmed it. Nobody ever saved a sample of it. No U.S. agency. You'd think the military would be interested in that, because think about it. It was from the spike protein, a portion of this genetic code that was like, 1,200 letters or something like that. It was the spike protein, part of that sequence, that went into the COVID vaccine. Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, that genetics was inside all of those shots. So you'd think, especially for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that are said to cause the body to produce the spike protein, you'd think the military would be interested in understanding it's called provenance. This is the P word that I use over and over again that nobody uses.
Yes.
Select subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic won't use this word. If you do a provenance investigation, you try to find where this thing came from. You find nobody ever verified it, the bowel fluid. And then if you try to do a provenance search of where the sequence came from of SARS-CoV-2, you get goose egg as well. There's no in-depth provenance analysis of how they did it. How did you figure out that this was the sequence and from which sample? Those are mysteries right now. So that got me thinking, okay, there's something going on with the sequence. I started pulling threads and, stuff just started unraveling.
When and I agree with what you're saying. Like when you have the big debates, when I look at this, I look at it from a different perspective. Like, yes, I've read a lot of research on COVID and the vaccines and so forth, and I knew that they were working on this type of program for a long time. The one thing that I noticed when I read a lot of the research with respect to COVID, most of the time they didn't call it a virus; they called it a virus particle, right? Which is very strange, because even when I was younger and I looked at the way the virus worked, they didn't make sense. Now, I think what both sides of the argument, they're partially right and they're partially wrong, because I think, yes, environment has something, and yes, you can put pathogens, because you can put amoebas in a person's brain and they will die, right? So you have to look at, there's some things in between. And I listened to what Dr. Tao Brun had to say about the RET 13, or R, was it, no, I'm the R, oh,
RATG 13.
that's it, the G, I'm missing it. But yes, how that it was basically the sequence from like a cervical plug for the bats, which would explain the fibrous clots. But when you sit down and think about how, when you going back to the diffuse, this is what people have to understand. Going back to the diffuse project, where they wanted to go and vaccinate the bats, and then you had Munster that wanted to go further than even what Peter Daszak wanted to do. He wanted it to touch, it would rub off on your skin and so forth. Now, if you're going to roll out a vaccine, you're going to spend all of this money on doing this. You're going to test to see whether it worked or not. And the spike protein is being produced in your body by the vaccine. This is the stuff that they're shedding and sending into there, primarily into other people through shedding. You're going to want to test to see whether or not that's going to spread before you roll out that vaccine. Nobody's going to, as an engineer, no one is going to spend that money on a weapon without testing it first.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And diffuse is important, and we keep bringing it up, and people aren't sure why, and that's mostly because the people in charge of the ones who are supposed to be getting this information out, like the select subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic, who of course are from the U.S. House of Representatives. Senator Rand Paul is doing investigations too. Senator Johnson. They're not giving us the full story. So they'll say things like, okay, Morenz, yeah, he pled guilty to conspiracy. And that gives you a lot, because that it just doesn't give you the full story. It does give you that you have top NIAID officials, top U.S. officials admitting to committing conspiracy to defraud Americans. And I think across the board, the people on our side who believe in some sort of lab origin, we resonate with that. But what they don't tell you is why it's really significant that Morenz is even in the spotlight right now, which makes me fearful that Fauci and Morenz are just fall guys. They're being put out there for us as low-hanging fruit. Because as you rightly said, you're bringing up diffuse, and that's what made Morenz so interesting to the COVID origins investigation, because he admitted to, by using Gmail, by not using his government accounts, blocking FOIA requests and whatnot. That's the information that he was blocking. It was relative to his communications with EcoHealth and Wuhan Institute of Virology and Barrick and his system at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, they submitted this proposal to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, that outlined how to create SARS-CoV-2 like viruses before SARS-CoV-2 allegedly emerged. And let's get granular about it. It actually outlined using a furin cleavage site. Well, let's back up.
Yes.
It first talked about a 6-segmented coronavirus, which is what Ralph Baric patented years and years and years ago, and that's,
No.
lo and behold, what Diffuse talked about. Diffuse focused on the spike protein, and that's another thing that Baric patented in 2018, just before the pandemic, how to make these modular chimeric coronavirus spike proteins, which, lo and behold, was in the Moderna and Pfizer shot, and he had these contracts with Moderna in early December, just before the outbreak. But the main point is, you've got this Diffuse talking about a 6-segmented coronavirus, and its spike protein would have a furin cleavage site that other coronaviruses just don't have. This is just like unheard of, that it would have a furin cleavage site. That's enough. That's
Yes.
enough right there to give you, okay, this Diffuse thing is something we should be looking at. But you don't just have the furin cleavage site. You have the receptor binding domain. The Diffuse spells out very clearly how Baric would work on these receptor binding domains that were humanized. Then you have another one. You've got the 2-proline aspect that nobody talks about. This is one of the most incriminating. Baric actually recommended in Diffuse to use this 2-proline structure when you make a vaccine. In other words, the idea is you have to substitute out these 2 amino acids for you put these 2 prolines back to back right here, and that's supposed to like stabilize something. Whether you agree that worked or not for vaccines, or that's legitimate or not, it was in Diffuse, and that's what Moderna and Pfizer et al. Ended up using. So you have in Diffuse, it's the most smoking gun document out there. And that's what, to put a circle on it, that's why Morenz is important. But you're not hearing that from the mainstream. They're not explaining he was trying to protect Diffuse, which
Yes.
the government tried to classify before it got out. And that's interesting to me and significant, I think.
It is. And when you look at this, like, I mean, they didn't talk to the right people. When you looked at COVID, you primarily heard from doctors, and that was it. And they were talking about everything. And I actually talked about this because doctors are talking about things that industrial hygienists should be doing and other people should be doing. They talked about what engineers should be doing and technology should be doing. They were basically, because they wore the white coat, they were like, trust us. And it was like, you don't even know what you're talking about. You shouldn't even be doing this. But
Yes.
Lo and behold, yes, they are. But at the end of the day, most people the average person doesn't realize it doesn't matter what weapon you're using. If you're using any type of weapon, you need an engineer for that weapon to get delivered. Think about it. The needle. Who do you think designed the needles? They were engineers, right? The same thing. So when you're looking at this, people have to start looking at how things are being delivered. Because when I look at the way things are set up, this tells me a weapon is being delivered. You wouldn't do this because let's go back to SARS-CoV-1, right? 2002. Everybody needs to go in and look at something called Amoy Gardens, right? In Hong Kong. They took these buildings and they demonstrated, and they did a study through computational fluid dynamics and all this engineering to demonstrate how these aerosolized particles were passing through, and they could show you where the infections were, how it traveled, how the wind patterns were even pushing, because it wasn't properly contained. So the air that was coming in was pushing the contamination from one place to the next. And they understood this very well. And they were screaming for more stringent engineering controls at this time. But what did the CDC do? They actually made it worse, and they quietly did it. And then they pushed it out for COVID. So when you sit down and they understand how these things are being transmitted, and then you have a guy that comes and says, let's go ahead and make these vaccines spread through aerosols. Like, this is just like, makes my alarm bells go off, because they know how this spreads. They understand it. And then when you look at a lot of these vaccines, the diseases themselves are literally the precursors for the vaccines. Because what they did with SARS-CoV-2, they're working on this for Nipah virus, which is also an aerosolized pathogen that they found in the genomic profile that tells you they were messing around with this stuff to do something even worse. And Nipah virus is much worse than COVID. And then that vaccine, you're going to go and take that and inject it into your body, into the spike protein like they did with SARS, COVID? No. Right?
And when I think of weaponization, there's of course the aspect of people getting sick, but I think you'd agree, like the ventilators were worse, and the government response was worse. Handing out vaccines that have been linked to millions and millions and millions of 17 million by Rancourt and all up in your neck of the woods up there in Canada. He said 17 million people have died from the COVID vaccine. But even if you take the CDC's own numbers from their National Adverse Events Reporting System, there have been about 40,000 deaths from the COVID vaccine, linked to the COVID vaccine. Correlation isn't always causation, but there have been 40,000 links. And Dr. Lazarus and Harvard Pilgrim commissioned a report, gave it to Congress that said less than 1%, fewer than 1% of any adverse reaction, including death from vaccines, are even reported in the first place. So anytime you get a number from VAERS, you have to put 2 zeros after it to get a closer,
Yes.
Figure to the truth. So that puts us at
Yes.
somewhere around 4 million. So whether you're with Rancourt and you think there have been 17 million deaths linked to the vaccine, or you're with the CDC and Harvard Pilgrim, you put those ideas together, 4 million. Those deaths from the vaccine, plus the ventilators, plus the psychological problems they cause to our children, forcing them to be in masks they couldn't see as they're growing up. These developing minds don't get to see human faces talking to them with their mouths, completely ruining these poor innocent children. Not to mention ours. COVID was one of the worst things. Was the worst thing I've ever been through as a millennial. I mean, I remember 9/11, and this is far worse than 9/11 because it only killed a couple thousand people, if you believe the mainstream story. But COVID killed how many? And it might have come from a lab, and then the vaccine killed people. So when I think of weaponization, I'm not primarily thinking of a virus. I'm thinking of the government creating a pandemic industrial complex, which they have created. I have the documents. They've intentionally created where they lasso NIAID, NIH, HHS, DOD, DARPA, Department of Homeland Security, you name the agency, they've corralled them through various laws to create this streamlined pipeline, this vertically integrated government public-private partnership for this pandemic orchestrating apparatus. And that's what I'm most interested in. It's not necessarily that. So all that to say, when I'm thinking about weaponization, I'm not really thinking about a pathogen per se. I'm thinking about this entire system, and how does that entire system even function? How do you get cases? Well, you get it from PCR tests, which are linked to a sequence. How do you get a virus? Even on the mainstream lab leak story, it all starts from a sequence. So and the sequence, to me, is really the crux of it, and that's what was weaponized. The sequence itself, because it was operationalized, it was canonized, it was authorized, it was given power. The powers that be all around the world said, this is the sequence. And from that sequence, you could get cases. And if you get enough cases, you can get a pandemic. And the sequence was obviously behind the vaccine. So to me, my whole universe sort of, orbits around sequences.
Yes. And I agree with you. Like, but what I tell people, COVID of itself, and I believe that they created something that they called COVID. So I don't think it is exactly what people says. When they say COVID, I don't think of the traditional virus, because I know that's garbage. Everything that they made was completely fabricated. This was constructed, and it was designed to do harm. So when I say that, I mean, it's not what most people think, but they did something. The reason being is this, and from everything that I can look at
Right.
and what I see is that they tested what was in the vaccine to make sure that that would work. It wasn't designed to be lethal, and it was designed to trigger another
Mhm.
train of events leading up to this because they wanted to make sure that it worked. And one of the people were like, oh, this hasn't been isolated and everything else like this. I'm like, people are lying to you. I said, first of all, if everybody knew exactly what they did, this would have been stopped a long time ago. And you have to sit down and think. You have the military behind this. You have a bunch of uh, criminals and governments across the countries. The pharmaceuticals are using the BSL-4 labs as they're basically to do their work. The government is paying for the pharmaceuticals to develop whatever they want. And this is a problem. This is not what should be done. So they have all of this so then they can go ahead and stick the most concentrated form in you. But if you don't want to comply, we can still give it to you when you go into an indoor space. This is what I saw was COVID. And most of the stuff, it wasn't lethal, but the stuff that they did after that was far more lethal so they could stick you with the real stuff. And then when they come with the next stuff, it's going to be worse because you don't want to apply, they're just going to kill you. The depopulation.
Right. Right. And what makes me so focused on sequences is it's not even just like my hunch from, even doing the blast work or figuring out that you can't find the provenance of either the BALF fluid or the sequence itself. It's DARPA admits it themselves. I don't have to make up the sequence centric nature of this pandemic industrial complex that they've been working on since way before 2010. But 2010 is when you get DARPA's operation called Prophecy, and in Prophecy, the DARPA envisioned being able to predict. These are their words. Predict future pandemic pathogens. These are pathogens that don't exist yet. So way back in 2010, and they were funding Barrick's lab through Donaldson. So Barrick's is connected to this all the way back to 2010 in Prophecy. But the idea is with the same end goal, like we said in the beginning, with the end goal of producing a vaccine, quote, ahead of need. This is Prophecy's DARPA's words, 2010, creating mRNA, creating vaccines ahead of need in response to a future pandemic pathogen that does not exist yet. So it was all about creating sequences. If there's no pathogen, what is it that Prophecy was about creating? Sequences. Because once you have a sequence, you can do DARPA's next operation, which was ADEPT in 2011. ADEPT was all about taking sequences and creating mRNA vaccines from them, because a sequence is, it's a genetic, construct. And so they wanted to make countermeasures, vaccines from those genetic constructs. So you're an engineer. You can understand there's a clear pipeline going on here. There's a clear succession in 2010 Prophecy. Give us sequences, give us letters of some pathogen that doesn't exist at all. That's a pandemic pathogen. That's what Prophecy was about. Next year, with ADEPT, let's make vaccines from that sequence. And then you have, after that, you have a gain of function research funding pause, roughly from 2014 to 2017. And what did that pause? And it was a funding pause. So it wasn't a pause in the actual research. It was a funding pause. I'm really careful to say that. And but the really interesting thing, I don't even think the most interesting thing is, hey, we were funding COVID research at the time, because we were, of course. But it's that the funding pause only applied to 2 pathogen families. It only applied to influenza, which is what they're working on right now if we want to prognosticate about potential future pandemics, we could talk about influenza, bird flu, but that's what it applied to. And then SARS and MERS, which are coronaviruses. So one of those pathogens made a pandemic. The other one is the one that, top US officials are saying there's going to be another pandemic around bird flu. They've got all these different bills that have to do specifically with bird flu. All these Trump administration initiatives have to do with bird flu. Operation Gold Standard, $500 million, $500 million for bird flu and make an in-house bird flu vaccine. They're funding Moderna's mRNA bird flu vaccine. But anyway, that funding pause from 2014 to 2017 applied to coronavirus and influenza, but funding pause lifted. You've got DARPA's next program, which was P3, which was all about, you can see the clear line here. Let's compress the time frame of having a sequence and creating a mRNA vaccine from it down to 60 days. So recap, you've got DARPA's prophecy in 2010 saying, let's invent sequences for pathogens that don't exist. So it's sequence centric. The very next year in 2011, you've got ADEPT. Let's make mRNA countermeasures from sequences, even when we don't have the pathogen. Funding pause lifts. You immediately have P3. How do we compress the time between when we have a sequence and a countermeasure from it? And then the next one was preempt in 2018. This one's interesting because this is when DARPA said, these are my words, we need to create a wildlife backstory. We need to create a wildlife alibi for where potential future pandemic pathogens might come from. And then you have, of course, in 2018, Diffuse, which DARPA denies funding, but they just split it up with U.S. U.S. Merid. I can never say it right. They just split it up into other contracts. But what you have in Diffuse is exactly what that pipeline, that sequential pipeline, that it is an output of what DARPA et al. were working on. And now you have the specific application of those things. You have a sequence being created with very specific things, receptor binding domains and furin cleavage sites and tube proline. You have a wildlife backstory, and you have, which was what P3 was, and then the ADEPT aspect, of course, is they were recommending, vaccines from it. So you have everything, kind of culminating in Diffuse. That's why I start with prophecy and end in Diffuse, because it's so clear. And these are the things that people don't explain to us, how they're all so clearly connected. You can see the clear progression of what DARPA's been trying to do. They have new stuff now that they're doing because they've moved on to, now they want to be able to just predict like toxins and proteins that have never been seen before. So I worry about, what's going to happen in the future. Because if you can look at prophecy in hindsight, from prophecy to Diffuse, and say, hey, they were doing all this stuff, and if I'd have been paying attention to that stuff, I'd have seen how a coronavirus pandemic response was coming ahead of us. Well, we can look at what DARPA's doing right now to kind of prognosticate about what pandemics and threats might be coming down the pike here pretty soon.
But this is what people this is what people have to understand. Like, I mean, when they look at these things, and what you're seeing, for one, is you're looking at a biological weapons program. That's exactly what you're seeing, because they're like, okay, this is what we think is a problem, which you've just constructed to make a problem, and then you just go ahead and go further down the line, and like within COVID, they said, okay, the spikes protein's the problem, but we're going to get you the mRNA vaccine that's going to make the spike protein in your body, because that's what mRNA does. RNA is there to literally make proteins in your body. So if you're going to have problems with proteins, and this is why you had things like prions and all these types of things, malformed proteins, well, of course. And so when they're talking about, they're going to say, oh, well, we're going to have problems with proteins. Well, I know exactly what you're doing. You're just basically creating more of a problem and saying, oh, well, we're going to have these future ones that we're going to give to you. That's really all there is to it. Like, I mean, when I look at the last like 40 years, all I see is biological weapons program. I don't trust anything that they've said when it comes to like how we're getting sick. And when I'm watching how the funding is going and how they're doing research, you're poisoning us and making us sick, and then saying you're going to give us a cure, which you saw how well the COVID vaccine worked. It didn't. Unless you were trying to kill people.
Right. Right. and they admit to having done it before, because as soon as you say something like that, there's this sort of knee-jerk reaction that no, they wouldn't do that. There's, they wouldn't. Well, they've done it before, and they actually have the power through the PrEP Act to give us quote unquote therapeutics and countermeasures without us knowing about it. It's built into the PrEP Act's own language. I had an entire article just built on that, because once I saw that, it's really incredible. So it's not just that they've done it before and that was bad. Tuskegee and Operation LAC and Operation Sea Spray, and they might do it again. They can give us these things that they call countermeasures without any informed consent. So I think you're justified in saying that.
Of course. I mean, and when you look at it, this is what we're looking at. And the PrEP Act is, that needs to be dealt with in a large way. But there are other ways to deal with it, but not just the traditional way that people think, because suing to get rid of the PrEP Act is never going to work. And the guys in the government aren't just going to go ahead and get rid of it themselves. But there are ways legal ways that will remove PrEP Act protection. Like if you're involved in crime, you get no protection from that. And there's just that's not the way civil laws work. But people don't want to go down that route.
Yeah, and this problem is so massive. It can't. I don't think it can be fixed with, you fix this law here, or you repeal PrEP Act, or you do this one thing over here. This is a multi-decades long operation to create what I call a pandemic industrial complex, the PIC.
Yes.
This isn't one law. It's hundreds, if not thousands, of different laws working together. This is multiple agencies.
Yes.
Multiple. They split it up into multiple contracts, so it's really difficult for us to figure out. But they have a system. It's called PTT or PPT. I can't remember which one it is, but it's they have this. I don't know if it's Operation of Science and Technology, or there's another one that's sort of above HHS and DoD, who's really the main ones over this whole thing. And they actually have a system for corralling all these contracts. So for all the different studies that went on through Prophecy that were funded through ADEPT and P3, they actually have a system for corralling. Oh, this came from NIAID. This contract came from HHS. This contract came from NIH. This contract came from DARPA. They have a system for corralling those things, which just goes to show the centralization that's going on here. My point is, this is so big. Hardly anybody, even in our camp, really understand how big and how long and how many different operations. You kind of hear about, oh yeah, Moderna was part of ADEPT. They were, since 2011, Moderna was working with DARPA to create an mRNA vaccine for some alleged threat. So people kind of touch on preempt, but they don't understand how it's all this cohesive pipeline, and but it's way bigger than even DARPA, because it's all the agencies. What do you do about that? I mean, and I'd love to pose it to you, because you can't just repeal PrEP Act. Okay,
no,
there's a million other ways that they can get to you.
Yes, we'll take a short break and we'll discuss this, because there's a lot to unpack there about how this comes together and people don't understand it. But we'll be right back after this commercial.
And may God bless you on your journey. And may God bless you on your Perio, co-founder of Mark37.com. I spent my career in Silicon Valley working for high-tech infrastructure companies, and I've witnessed firsthand the surveillance apparatus they've built. Most of you already know we're in a digital war right now, but are you really aware that we're trying to fight this war with the weapons and tools of the enemy? That Android or iPhone in your pocket, that MacBook or Windows laptop, it's a tracking device feeding everything you say and do to companies that want you under their control or eliminated entirely. Every text, call, location, even how long you pause on a post, they track it all and use complex algorithms to then use this data to manipulate your behavior. If you knew someone hacked your devices and was selling your data without your consent, you'd be furious and terrified. So why are you okay with these companies doing this to you right now? Here's what they don't want you to know. There is another way. At mark37.com, we offer phones, laptops, tablets, and even basic flip phones, all running systems big tech can't access unless you explicitly give them access. And what's even better is you also don't need to sacrifice productivity. I'm one of thousands of geeks mobilized across this country, building tools and providing education and support to help you live anonymously online before they enforce digital ID. Go to mark37.com. Sign up for a free 30-minute digital privacy consultation. Join hundreds of thousands who have decided to stop feeding their data to companies actively working to enslave us. Take back your communications. Take back your data. And may God bless you on your journey.
So if anybody wants to go to mark37.com and use the promo code Karis to get a 5% discount, or you can go to the links that you'll see in the description. Yeah, I mean, protecting data is important. But kind of getting back to what we were saying here, this whole issue, like, okay, with the way the agencies communicate. General Flynn, after Afghanistan, went out and talked about some of the issues with the agencies and with the term stovepiping. And this is how COVID got to the way it was, because they make sure that they funnel information only through this narrow amount of people, and then the agencies aren't connected. So the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, so that they can do all of these things, coordinate them, and then be like, oh, well, we don't know how this happened. Well, yes, you do, because you made sure that these people couldn't see what you're doing. And somebody was overseeing it to make sure that all of these things ended up coming to create the perfect storm, while the useful idiots that they have at the front going, well, I don't know what's going on. And this is how they accomplish these things. Now, for the only way you get rid of these things is criminal investigation. This is the only how you can deal with it in the fastest way, because when you start arresting people, then you can start nullifying all of these civil protections. Then you can get the push to make sure that these things change. But until people get arrested and there's accountability, nothing's going to change. Because suing them is never going to work.
And, you know, people, yeah, and people have a hard time understanding how it could all be, how could everything be orchestrated? How could all these agencies be in on the same thing? And the answer is the PHEMCE. This was a initiative. This was an implementation plan that was put forward by HHS. It stands for the Public Health Emergency Medical Countermeasure Enterprise, PHEMCE. And what it did was it centralized 7 different federal agencies and private industry into a, quote, holistic end-to-end, end quote, pandemic industrial complex. HHS told government and industry to, quote, align and synchronize. That's a direct quote. Can't get any more clear than that. Align and synchronize. And they even said that the benefits went beyond curing disease. Yeah, because the benefits are that they could, you know, make money. But PHEMCE centralized 7 named federal agencies and components, which was ASPR, CDC, FDA, NIH, DOD, DHS, and the VA, and then all their sub agencies across 4 different cabinet departments. That'd be HHS, DOD, DHS, and the VA. So for the people who say, you know, there's no way this whole thing was orchestrated, it's not about orchestrating the COVID pandemic and the operation for orchestrating the COVID pandemic. You could kind of argue, maybe diffuse, but what this is about is creating that, again, pandemic industrial complex. It's a system.
Yes.
It's an apparatus that corrals all the agencies and all these private pharmaceutical companies for the stated end goal of creating pharmaceuticals for some sort of a threat that's out there. So this isn't. It's not just that it's a possibility that this has all been orchestrated. It's actually in official documents that PHEMCE is what creates that vertically integrated system. So it's there, and they admit it.
Yes, and then you have to look at what they're actually accomplishing with this, because they're using these pandemics to effectively suspend the U.S. Constitution, which is, they can't do that any other way. And they're using fear and so forth to do it, because they're doing things that are extremely unconstitutional, and then they're committing crimes, and then they're trying to hide behind all of these things to get away with this. And this is a problem, right? When you look at what they're doing here. And you have to understand, just look at the evidence. Forget about what you think. And this is why they put them in suits, they put them in government and everything else like that, because people don't want to believe that they're going to be people that are criminals inside of the government. But you have to understand that the people that were doing this, for whatever their reasons, they're not anything good. And it doesn't matter about even the idiot that you see in front of you that seems incompetent, doesn't know what they're doing. There's a lot of people behind them that are coordinating these things. Because if you look at the chances of all of these things happening just by sheer happenstance and random convergence, it is statistically zero. It is impossible for this to happen. So what's the alternative? How can this happen? Well, it has to happen because there are minds behind it coordinating and directing these things for a specific outcome. And that's the only logical conclusion that you can come to based on looking at the evidence.
And it's a system that creates conflicts of interest. The ones who have the power to operationalize a sequence like SARS-CoV-2 or any sequence are the same ones who are making drugs that are supposed to combat that, that alleged pathogen from that sequence. By design. That's the whole thought from the very beginning. So you have this sort of Hegelian dialectic, problem, reaction, solution, where diffuse is a perfect example of that. Diffuse, you have before COVID, this document that leaked and was dated 2018. Most of what was discussed in it, the first half, had already been completed through prophecy and the following DARPA projects that I was mentioning. But in diffuse, it described the problem. The problem is this SARS-CoV-2 like virus with RBDs and furin cleavage sites and 2-proline. That's the problem that we envision might happen in the future. Lo and behold, that's exactly what you get. Big smoking gun there. Well, that same document, that same pre-COVID-19 pandemic document also suggested the alleged solution to that problem, which was a vaccine. And lo and behold, DARPA had been working on that for years and years and years. So it's this Hegelian dialectic, this problem and solution, the government's doing right now with bird flu. There's on my website, there's study after study coming out just over and over and over again. If you go to PubMed and just type in H5N1 or just type in influenza and NIAID or influenza and NIH, you'll see they're doing all the same kind of studies, looking for monoclonal antibodies, making vaccines. They're doing reverse genetics on bird flu, while these same so they're doing the gain of function research on bird flu right now, while at the same time creating vaccines for bird flu, which just it obviously raises questions. There's financial incentive there, and then really there is, I'm not saying they did do it, but I'm saying there is an incentive, a hidden incentive there, that obviously if there's a big problem like a pandemic and a virus comes out, that they're going to make a lot of money on it. So they have an incentive for there to be a pandemic. So it just, raises lots of questions, I think.
It's like the military industrial complex provoking wars to go ahead and to line the pockets of the weapons manufacturers and the defense contractors. It's no different, right?
Yeah. And that's what I think is going on here. Now my opinion is, I think they're committing fraud, and I have now Morin's plea to be able to stand on, that the top officials guarding diffuse are admitting to conspiracy and fraud. So what I think this is what I think they're doing. I think it's too messy, and I think impossible for them to actually. This is my opinion, pure opinion. I don't think they're making pathogens or making viruses. I think what they're doing is they're creating sequences and a wildlife backstory for those sequences, so they can say, they can point back to all that work and say that it justifies. Because, like, if you think about it, it was Barrick's own group and WIV who were, for example, contributing all the GenBank ascension numbers to all the different quote unquote, COVID variants. It was that same group. They were the ones creating the system that after the outbreak, the mainstream was pointing to as justification for some sort of natural, origin of the virus. It's like the fox guarding the hen house. So I think what they're doing is they need to be able to say there's a pandemic. Because what they ultimately want are the lockdowns, the masking, I think, because in their history too, there's an incentive for them to maybe want to hurt us through depopulation that they all admit to. But how do you get cases? How can you get a case number, let alone a case number that says, oh, it's reached this number, we're at a pandemic? It's through PCR tests. And how does a PCR test even work? You have to have a sequence. And we can get into all the there's many problems about PCR. I'm just talking about, how do you actualize a pandemic response from the government, which is what they want ultimately. They don't want to quash out some alleged virus. They want to lock us down and mask us and inject us. That's what they want. Well, how do you get that? You have to have a pandemic. Well, how do you have enough case numbers? Well, you have to test with PCR. Well, what are they testing? They're testing that sequence. So they take a sequence and they invent it, and they admit they're doing this through prophecy.
Yes.
I think they make a sequence. They're creating the backstory with all these studies for years and years and years, so that when they choose to operationalize a pandemic, they have that sequence that they can plug in, and that is the reference point, the authorized canonical reference point that everything else hinges on. Everything hinges on a sequence. So I think they're making sequences, creating the backstory. I doubt there's actually a pathogen out there. There might be other ways that they're affecting us with chemicals or something they're spraying, or in the water or in the food or something like that. But I think that's ultimately what's going on here. I call it in silico theory instead of in vivo, in the body.
Yes.
This is something that's or in vitro inside of a petri dish. This is in silico. It's purely in silico. It's a digital creation. It's a story that they've created so that they can then do their government response to us.
I understand what you're saying and the points what you're making. When I look at it from just as an engineering perspective, this is where I sit down and say, okay, they can put out whatever sequences they want, but whatever they're putting in the vaccine, they've already made this. And this is what they're working on, because they don't know that how the vaccine is going to make this until they actually do it themselves. And this is what they're doing. This is why I say that the pathogens that they consider, they are precursors to the vaccine, because they are testing them. And like, for example, like with the diffuse, where they're putting this, they know that they can get in through your eyes and your nose. This is where the aerosolization and then you can have issues coming into your lungs, but primarily to get in, you're going to go through your nose and your eyes for the vaccination. And so they're going to do some limited testing. Yeah, a lot of the stuff, they're lying about a lot of stuff, and they're never going to tell you exactly what it is until it gets out into your body. And this is what I guarantee you is what they're doing, because you will not put all of that money in there without testing it to see that it's going to do as it's intended. And then they want to then transmit it. So a lot of this stuff, they're lying in the PCR test, that you don't know what you're actually looking at, but they are putting some things out that you can sit down and say, okay, they know there's markers that are in the spike proteins that are in the vaccines that they know that match up to certain things. So will they put out some of the stuff in there to just throw it in your face? Sure. A lot of the stuff, are they doing? Are they lying? Yes, because if people actually saw everything that they're doing, they would be in prison. But they have to be testing it. No one develops any weapon without testing it. This is why I sit down and say they are doing something they're lying to us about it, and we want to find
Yes.
out why, right?
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. So it sounds like you share a lot of territory with Jim Haslam. Have you been following Jim Haslam's work at all?
Yes, I have. I've looked at some of the stuff that he's been doing, and it aligns with this because I believe that what, like the PCR test, they're lying. I mean, when I look at the way that they talk about viruses coming in nature, they're lying about that as well, because everything that I see is manipulation, and they're doing something wrong, and they're lying to us. But they are doing something to kill us, because clearly everybody sees the events. And this is also one of the reasons why they do what they're doing. It's called plausible deniability. When you have so much misinformation about, or half truths or partial misdirections, you're never going to get to the real issue. By the time they get to it, you've got the vaccines, and then half the people are dead. And then when they're looking at, they're going at the flu, and then they look at things like Nipah virus, which they poisoned people and understood that this kills more
Yeah.
people effectively. So if they come with a
Yes.
vaccine for that, what is it going to do to the population, right? We need to,
Yes.
this is why I sit down and say criminal arrest is the only way you're going to get this thing shut down. Until you can arrest people, walk into those places, find out exactly what they're doing at the behest of the pharmaceutical companies, then we really don't know. We don't. That's the scary part of it.
And the scariness is extrapolated because of how slow the information's coming out. I mean, I can't. I gave up thinking that maybe something would come out of Congress. I love Rand Paul and some of the stuff he's been putting out, and Johnson and Marshall. They've been putting out some really good stuff. But like one of the last things Paul put out was that Fauci was kind of a narcissist, and it's like, what? Like this is like in the 80s and 90s we knew this about Fauci, and so I'm kind of worried about how slow this quote unquote information they're slow feeding us. And then this thing with Morans and Fauci, if you're a Fall Guys, I don't think this is ever going to be explained. They're so focused on, well, it was lab leak or natural origin. They're still on that. It's like they're not even talking about how all the DARPA things are connected, all
It's
the agencies connected, how the apparatus works. I fear nothing can ever happen from it. I also wanted to ask about, you know, a lot of this is based on PCR, and PCR has a lot of problems that I know you're aware about. And I think it's one of those things where my view, I think, makes a little more sense of the situation because it can account for that PCR angle. Because even in our circle, and I have like no enemies. I'm open to any possibility. I'm just sort of
yeah.
talking with you. Um, Even the people who believe in a lab leak or a lab centric origin, they'll still talk about, and if there's like a real pathogen, well, how do we confirm that pathogen's there? It's all with PCR testing. But there's a lot of problems with PCR testing. It's not just the false positives. There's study after study where they'll take a sample that tested positive under PCR, and then they'll try to culture it, and they won't get any culturing to happen. And these studies confirm that that PCR has something like a 98, 99. I have an article on it with the peer reviewed, study. It's like 98, 99% false positives. And they also have false negatives. But the biggest problem that nobody talks about, and this is like a provenance thing, I'm always, going for provenance here, is I call it the PCR black box. And that's that these primers and these probes that are used, that are supposed to carry, certain mirror pieces of this genetic sequence, they don't test to make sure that all of those primers and probes, the sequences on the primers and probes, are in the correct order. And if you go and you tell this to, so there's no confirmation. The people doing the field test, the boots on the ground doing the testing, aren't checking for it. And the manufacturers aren't checking for it either. The manufacturers will use mass spec on the big powder that they sell to companies, or as a liquid, but they're not, so they'll weigh it. But that's their metric for saying that we're, confirming the sequences
But
are accurate. But that's, yeah, go ahead, go for it.
no. They just kind of, just to answer your question, it's because virus, like what they tell you about viruses, it's a lie. They don't replicate. They don't. You need to culture something. You need it to replicate. You can't. They've lied to you the whole time. What they're doing is creating proteins and other types of toxins to put in your body. And this is how do you get the spike protein to get into your body? They have to replicate it by injecting mRNA into your body. Where do you,
Right.
like, when you look at how a virus is supposed to operate, that you're supposed to have this genetic fragment with a protein sheath that just attaches to a cell. How does that happen? Like, it's not alive, but it's not dead, but it has genetic material. Like, give me a break. Functionally, it doesn't make any sense. And I've always, since I was a kid, was like, how does this actually work? Because, like, with a cell, you understand that there's chromosomes, you have all the different parts that in there, but in a virus, it's just a protein sheet and mRNA. Give me a break. So this is why they can't culture anything. They can't.
Right. And I mean, I am even getting to the point now where I'm doubting that mRNA is really even a legitimate thing, or genetics, as they tell it to us, is even a legitimate thing, because I'm looking for direct observations, and again, provenance. And
Mm-hmm.
anytime I look at anything, I want to know, okay, well, how do we know that? Well, how do we know that? Well, how do we know that? Well, where did that come from? And if you keep asking these questions, you find out that anything that's genetics based, from when they started working on it until now, from COVID to any other, quote unquote pathogen or bacteria or animal, it's always based on inferences. There's no direct observation of the human genome. Even Kary Mullis and all the people who were in charge of mapping the human genome didn't map like they didn't like look at one person's genome. These are computers that are assembling things, these consensus sequences where they're taking consensus of things. Even the way that they prove they exist, electrophoresis and all of these things, these are not direct observations. They're applying chemicals and solutions to things, and then they're taking readings with apparatuses, and they are getting readings of things, but they interpret these bands on these electrical signals produced as standing for this is definitely the COVID genome. These are inferences. They are not direct observations. And so I think when you start asking those kind of questions, even genetics itself starts to have, I think, some really big lacunas, some big holes in understanding.
Yes, and I think that the way our understanding of what it is not what we think it is. Like, have we observed chromosomes and what they do? Yes, we've observed this. People can see these with microscopes and so forth. You don't need to do anything fancy to do that. Now, all of the stuff that they're doing now, do I trust what they're doing? No, I don't. But at the end of the day, we do know that they're doing something to us. They know that they're getting, like they said, they've added in, there is DNA contamination in there. And what people have to understand is that RNA serves a purpose. When you have, and they know this from a long time ago by observing this, when you have your chromosomes, they open and you'll have other things come up there and they will go on to do the different processes in the cells. These were observable. And so whatever they're doing something to get that to produce these proteins in our body. They know how to produce these proteins. The way that they're telling us to detect them, they're just way off because they're lying to you about something and saying that these things evolved out of nature. They didn't. They're lying, right? And so you're being told to look at this, to go ahead and test for this, but it's actually something else. And you can't culture something that's not alive. It's just not possible. It's not a living thing. It might be a biological protein or so forth, but it's not a living thing and it can't self-replicate. So they're doing a whole lot of lying.
Say, and I agree. And they say they can, so that's their argument, is that these PCR tests are legitimate and they're confirming that something is there. But when you ask the questions like how How are you figuring that out? How does PCR work? What is a primer? What is a probe? What is it attaching to? When does it attach? How much of the sequence is in a primer and in a probe? When you start looking at these things, it starts falling apart, and I have now the impression that this, when you look into any aspect of this story, COVID origins, the genetics of it, the virus side, the sequence, the this, the that, you start to see it's built on, in my opinion, fraud. I think they had to create a problem because they wanted the solution. That was always the goal. A vaccine and pandemic response was always the main goal. But how can you have a pandemic response without a pandemic? I think they had to create a pandemic. And I don't think they did it by creating a pathogen and then letting it out. I think they did it by creating a sequence, making a backstory for SARS-CoV-2, that it came out of the wildlife, and then they actualized that sequence. They put the sequence in GenBank, and once the sequence is in GenBank, now all the labs all over the world have a reference that they can
Yes.
start doing their PCR tests with, and then therefore, getting a COVID positive case. But provenance, you go back to the sequence, start asking questions about the sequence, you realize, yeah, go ahead.
But just go back even further to this. Where does this whole concept come from? Think about this. The idea of viruses and how they come and they evolve comes from evolution. This is where it all comes back to. This comes back to the biggest lie, because as when I sit down, I think, and I design stuff, it takes huge amounts of brain power to design something that is nowhere near as complex as a cell. And you're going to tell me that all of these things came from random happenstance. But this is what you're doing. This is basically how they're telling you that they evolve in all these things, but it's a lie. This is really what it comes down to. It comes down to that original lie, and all of these things come from it. Because at the end of the day, the people who do this, they feel like they're God and they can do whatever they want. And they will say whatever lie that they can to get out what they need to go. Because things don't evolve. They don't.
You'll like this one. Do you know where GenBank came from? Do you know where it was developed?
No, I don't.
Like originally at a U.S. nuclear weapons lab.
Oh, yes, I did know that.
It created this computer-centric, sequence-based system that powers these modern outbreak and pandemic response. So, like how I write about it in the article when I explain, but I mean, just think about that. Like the bank that has all the sequences that are the operationalizable references that can operationalize a government's pandemic response, masking, cases, surveillance, vaccines, all the bad stuff, the worst stuff, way worse than the virus, in my opinion. All of the sequences were created and are stored in this bank that was created by in Los Alamos at this U.S. nuclear weapons lab. So before a computer can compare, classify, track, or model anything, someone must first decide which digital representation becomes the authoritative one. And that problem was largely solved in 1982. And that was the year that the United States established GenBank. It was the world's first comprehensive public repository for published nucleotide sequences. So I just thought it was interesting where, you're talking about the complexity of it and bioweapons. Well, put those together and you get, part of the origin story of how, where are these sequences stored, and where does the world look to them? And well, it's in GenBank, and GenBank was made at a weapons lab. So it just goes to when I think of weaponization and COVID or pandemic industrial complex, that's sort of where my strange mind goes to, is this weapons lab creating GenBank for us. Oh, and then by the way, GenBank is the thing that's always used for any pandemic as justification for the pandemic.
Yes.
How do you know this sequence exists? Well, GenBank tells us. Well, how do you know this COVID sequence exists? Well, it's in GenBank. Well, GenBank came from a weapons lab. Just interesting, I think.
Well, yes, and this again comes back down to we need to find out what is being done because there is so many things that are going on. And this is one of the things, and we know that they poison us through spraying stuff on us all the time, whether it's chemical, biological, it doesn't matter. They're poisoning us in this way. And when I came down in Canada in 2020, I actually filed criminal negligence complaints over the engineering control. Because I said it doesn't matter what it is. You could have bacteria, you could have a parasite, you could have a fungus, it doesn't matter. You can aerosolize it and it fits in that aerosol, you're going to cause problems. And we know things like that can cause problems because we see the effects of that. Like, mold and parasites and bacteria can get in and do nasty things. Now, when you do this, you've just created a means for things to spread in a bad way. And when you look at the fact that they want to spread vaccines, whatever, God knows what they're doing, but they're going to put that in you. The more toxins you put in, more you're going to have problems with your body. This is why I sit down and say, yes, you have a bit of both, because I know that parasites can infect your body and cause nasty problems. So can bacteria, so can mold and fungus. And those things are definitely contagious. And yes, your environment does that. So when you're doing this is a crime. What the CDC did, and this is the thing, the CDC was tasked with allowing things like this to spread. And like, for example, with the protein there, that's like the bat cervical plug that actually requires the mold for it to activate the fungus, right? Which is going to cause that in order to activate. This is what Dr. Brum is talking about. And so you're committing a crime. But at the end of the day, that's the first step of the pandemic response. And I told them this. I went to the government and so forth, and I filed criminal negligence complaints. Then the police, with the FBI, the RCMP in Canada is the equivalent of the FBI. They wouldn't take any more information. So when I went ahead and I took them to court, and when I went to court, they arrested me at the direction of the court, and they strapped me to a bed and drugged me against my will. So when I sit down and I look at the response, I'm like, I touched a nerve. Because it's like, if you want to poison people, this is the best way to do it indoors. And it doesn't matter what it is, right? But you can reduce the amount that somebody can poison you by using proper ventilation rates, using dilution, diffusion, and destruction, because it will destabilize a lot of compounds. And they understand that. This is why outside in sunlight, things aren't as effective. And so when you look at that, and this is in 2020, at the same time, the CDC, who put out that, coincidentally, was working on Operation Warp Speed, right? And they have the higher responsibility than the DOD for that, because the DOD is not responsible for domestic. They're responsible for overseas, but they were there to do the implementation because they said we need military type implement rollout for this. The CDC was responsible for doing it, so they have the greater responsibility. So they're making sure that people get sick by poor air quality, more pathogens being spread, the natural stuff that we know about, and whatever, God knows what they were doing, so that they could justify the lockdowns, they could justify the ventilators, they could justify all of this. And the funny thing is, in the United States, in Title 18, you guys don't have criminal negligence, but you would have like conspiracy to defraud the United States and deprivation of rights under color of law and a couple other crimes to make up for that one. And those things, when somebody dies, guess what happens? That becomes a capital offense, right? So you can understand why people wouldn't want that investigated, but there's no statute of limitations because they're open. They just need the correct pressure, and somebody will have to deal with it. Because what Canada should have done was to contact the United States, and seeing that it was present in every other jurisdiction, and you're creating a critical weakness that anybody could exploit with anything at any given time and know that they're going to have a lot of success doing this, that's a huge problem, right? And by all means, they should have been arrested, but they couldn't have some kid coming out and doing this. Well, I'm not a kid, but you get what I'm saying. To say, why are you doing this, and why are there criminal complaints, and you're shutting down my businesses because of crime? And I'm a Christian. I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to let you kill people. Right?
That's a good line. I think that's a pretty reasonable line to have when you start killing people. It's a pretty good line.
Yes.
Are you at all hopeful? The more I look at this, the more complicated it is, and the more tentacles there are across more agencies and into more, like, you got to understand virology, you got to understand genetics, you got to understand politics, you got to understand Congress, you got to understand bills, you have to understand reverse genetics, you've got to understand all these different things to see how they all fit together, which makes it very difficult to see how they all fit together. Do you have any hope that the truth will actually come out?
I think that it will to a certain degree. I think that there'll be a lot of suppression when, regardless of all of these other fields that we look at, which are good to know. The one that most people overlook is human nature. We have to understand this more than anything else, because when it comes down to dealing with people, you have to understand that no matter what system you're dealing with, there is a human being that is on the other side of that or across from you, no matter what. And human beings will predictably act a certain way under certain circumstances. And when people start to begin to worry that there's consequences for their actions, they're going to start acting differently. This is why they went after the United States in the way that they would. They did, because the United States has a constitution like no one else's, and they have their laws like enshrined in there, and that they have rights. So they can't just go ahead and if they had their way and they could just pretty much mow people down in the streets, they would do that. They can't, right? And if they could, they would, because these people are evil. They don't care. If they had the ability to do that, they would, but they can't. So at this point in time, and I believe that God has a hand in this, and there's some restraint on what's going on. But until the people start holding them accountable, making them fear for their consequences, and that they're going to squirm, they're not going to do anything. And the people are the ones who are the drivers on this. And this is why there's so much division inside of between the people, and they're using look through social media. How many things are people fighting about? Everything except for the people who are killing us. Until the people figure out that the government is the biggest threat to us, right? The criminals in government are the biggest threat, then we're never going to get anything. But if we do that, then we'll get some help that we need. But at the end of the day, I think the only thing that's going to really fix this is when God puts it down altogether.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, Christ returning, I think, will be the only way we're gonna know the truth. To stop seeing through a glass darkly, like Paul talks about in Corinthians. I don't even think that if there were people inside of government right now who wanted us to know the truth, genuinely wanted to, and actually would, put their neck on the line to do it, I think that even those people don't know what are the right questions to ask. So even if they wanted to, I don't even think they'd know how to look or where to look, even with all their clearances and all the committees they're on and whatnot. I don't even think they would know how to look. I mean, nobody even asked Barrick about his connections to prophecy. And prophecy was all about, predicting future pandemic sequences. And it was ultimately out of prophecy that you got diffused, which Barrick was attached to. So it's like, did any part of prophecy whatsoever create any like haplotype or, phenotype or any of these kind of like genetic trees that was SARS-CoV-2 in any of those projections, in any of your prophesied pandemic pathogen sequences that you made? Did any of them look SARS-CoV-2 like? It's such a simple, obvious question. When you understand it, it's covered, and you've got to figure out that question by digging and digging and digging and digging. It took me years to even figure out that question.
Mm-hmm.
But these people in Congress aren't asking these questions, and they have way better access to this information than I do, and they have subpoena power. And they're not asking these simple questions. SARS-CoV-2's sequence might be sitting in some DARPA, prophecy something somewhere. Now, I FOIA'd for it about a month ago, and so I'll be publishing on whatever they send us. But that information's not out there. You can't find all the sequences that were generated from prophecy that Donald, who worked with Barrick, they generated, coronavirus sequences. Where are they?
Yes.
Pre-COVID, where are all those sequences? And are there SARS-CoV-2 like viruses in there? Because if there is, it's just game over. To me, diffuse is game over. But
Yes.
if that were to be found, that'd be game over. That's why I FOIA'd for it. But it's like I don't even think these people in Congress even know what sorts of questions to ask.
No, they
Frankly,
don't. Most of them don't. They don't. And then when it comes to getting information to them, it that's another problem because a lot of it is gate kept. There's a lot of gatekeepers. A lot of information does not and they will not want it to go there because then people will start asking the right questions or they'll be forced to. Like, for example, they had Peter Daszak coming in and they had him testify and they asked him questions. They talked about the BSL the BSL conditions to work on coronaviruses and so forth. Well, he said they were adequate. Really? You really that's your final answer? You're a doctor. You're a virologist. You're not an engineer or a technologist. So how can you say that that was adequate conditions? You're just way out of your wheelhouse. But nobody pays attention to things like this and these smaller details that people are overlooking because you need to have people asking the right questions and getting the right people in there to ask these questions. Because if you go, when I went back and I started to look in on the engineering side of things, I looked at that the CDC and the NIH and all these places they have of their sub agencies they have engineering they deal with engineers and like the engineers are very complicit like the Office of Research Offices of Research Facilities or Facilities Research. They go ahead and they work with like ASHRAE and the other engineering bodies to come up and test all of this stuff and make sure that their BSL-4 labs, stuff like that, work and that they have to do all of these the necessary steps. But when they came out to give out to the public, they just said, "Here, use this. It doesn't work, but we don't care." And they went ahead. So they knew what they were doing was wrong, and they put it out anyway. And then you're watching step by step by step doing these things. And when I see this, I see that somebody is creating a pathway to poison people with it doesn't matter. I don't care what it is. It's just the means to poison things because they're poisoning us in our food. They're poisoning us with everything. They're irradiating us. Why would you not poison people in the air? Like, I mean, when people sit down and say, "Oh, they're poisoning solid waste, but not that one," well, you're an idiot, right? I'm sorry, but like these guys, they have poisonous down to a science. Why are you going to
yes,
leave such a very easy and obvious way to do things? Because especially in the
yes,
air, when you can't see it, then people can say whatever they want. It's not like, you see somebody dropping cyanide into a drink and then you can test that the cyanide is there and see it or it changes color or whatever the case is. But when in the air,
right.
people just, they don't know. And that's the whole point. And when I look at the way that they defended that, when I raised that, that tells me, why would you do that? Like for somebody to just be like, "Get lost, whatever, we don't care." But to strap me to a bed and drug me against the will, that's
Yeah,
overkill.
yeah. That's another thing to this, isn't it? It's that the sort of people's ability to perceive what's going on, to have do they have eyes to see what's actually going on? People even they debate the whole chemtrail contrail thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, whatever side of that debate, and there are multiple sides on both sides. There are like subsides on each side. The whole Jim Lee versus Dane Wigington, camp. That's on they're doing it on purpose, and it's coming out, and it's actually negative. And then the mainstream view is, yeah, it's coming out, but it's not doing anything. It's just contrails, and they're defining contrails as just water. Well, whatever view, stuff comes out of airplanes, commercial ones,
Mm-hmm.
that when the conditions are right, leave trails that linger in the sky, disperse, and block the sun and sky. To me, that's crimes against humanity. How can you take away the sky and the sun from people? And NASA, NOAA, and the FAA admit that that's happening. So it doesn't matter like what side of the story, which side of the debate you're on. Stuff comes out of planes that blocks the sun and sky, and if it's blocking the sun and sky, it's made of this, metal nanoparticles and sulfur particles. This what goes up must come down. So it's
Yes.
obviously going to affect human health. And they don't have, long-term studies on this stuff, of course. And we probably know the answer why. But
Yes.
even stuff like that, it's hard for people to accept even like what their own eyes even see. They'll see this Morenz story come out where he's saying, yep, conspiracy, COVID origins cover up. I'm part of it. And he named it, and he said there were other people too. And they'll still go, no, there was no, conspiracy. The government wasn't trying to cover it. It's right in front of you. It's really interesting, people's ability to perceive things, or lack thereof.
Well, I think this comes with a lot of the part of the psychological operations, which is a huge part of this, which is actually the biggest part of this, because this is how they got people to go along with this whole thing. And this started in the school system and everything else like that, that they've been programming us to just think in a certain way. Even the way that they compartmentalize our learning, because if you look at like 150 years ago, they did not learn this way. They learned things as an integrated whole, because you can't separate English from math, because you need English to do math and all of these things in history. And so you sort of learned all of it and how it related to each other. But now they compartmentalize our learning, and then you just dial down and look at this very narrow thing, and everything else doesn't exist. And this is not a normal way to see things. This is not, because our life, it's all interconnected. And this is how we humans, even we think this way, because we associate one thing to another. But they're changing the way that we think, so that when you can't see outside of the way they teach you to think, and then they give you this government narrative. You want to believe that they're to help, and you don't want to believe the alternative, because the alternative, which is the truth, is true, then that means you have to do something about it. Your life becomes very difficult, because the people you think they're there to protect you are there to harm you. And then this is where people have cognitive dissonance like crazy.
Yeah, and you've got the National Intelligence Director, you got DNI Gabbard confirming that there's a media psyop going on, that she actually named Operation Mockingbird and admitted that this is still targeting Americans. This was back in, this was last year, somewhere around
Yes.
July or August of last year. And she confirmed that Operation Mockingbird's still going on, where this idea that the government has intentionally put people into the media so that they can control and curate the messaging that's going out. And then you put that next to the fact that the CDC and the Biden admin manipulated Americans with what was called deeply flawed COVID messaging, over-promising vaccines without evidence, misleading the public. Those are words from the House Energy and Commerce Committee. So, you put those together, and you have this perfect storm for people being completely misled and manipulated around the pandemic.
And the one thing that I will say about the pandemic, and this, I mean, I know we're going to end up having to run soon, because it's, I've got some stuff to do as well. But the COVID pandemic, and as a Christian, this is what struck me very starkly about the pandemic response. Everything that I saw with the lockdowns and all of these things, and how they isolated people and everything else like this, it was designed to counteract the work that the church did in the book of Acts. This is what struck me right off the bat. I was like, this is very wrong, and this is satanic in origin, because it was like the churches were shut down. You could go get liquor, but traditionally throughout history, churches would go, like during the bubonic plague, they didn't shut down the churches. There were ministers who were ministering their congregations. Some of them died, right? But this is traditionally the way it goes. But everything was restricting this. And then the attack on Christians and everything else like this, I'm like, there's something else going on. At the end of the day,
Wow.
My personal belief is that God is going to do something to arrest this, because his work needs to get done. And until that work is done, he's not coming. So the devil is trying to cheat, as far as I'm concerned, from what I'm looking at, and something is going to happen. Will it solve it completely? But it's going to be enough for God's people to get his work done, and then God's going to put this down. Because at the end of the day, when I look at all of the things that spiked up with COVID, like trafficking, destroying families, and everything else like this is not just only a pandemic. This is a system of slavery, because it wiped out the middle class. All of these other crimes became rampant. People stopped getting access to law enforcement, courts, and everything else like this. And all of these criminals are profiting off of the backs of people. And you can't tell me that you have a bunch of very intelligent people that could not foresee this, right? They have a bunch of extremely smart people that are system thinkers that are there thinking steps and steps ahead that would understand that these types of things happen. And even the UN says in crises, the kids go missing, right? They know this. And they bring it to our doorstep.
Yeah, and then they created the response. Now they would call it, pandemic preparedness, but they literally mapped out from at least prophecy and moving forward through diffuse and Operation Warp Speed. They planned the SARS-CoV-2 response. Now they would want to qualify that and say, well, we were doing that for biodefense to help you. We're the government. We're here to help you. That's why we really did it. But at the end of the day, no matter what side of any debate or side of any of this you're on, they planned the COVID-19 pandemic through prophecy and Operation Warp Speed. It's up to us to piece together whether there was any sort of conspiracy or defrauding going on. And if, we're listening to more end zone guilty plea, then I think there was some fraud. And so.
You're right. You know who Martin Furmansky is?
No.
You need to look at his head. You need to look at his paper. I can send it to you. They basically talked about self-fulfilling prophecies and things lessons learned that they knew from pandemic responses. They knew from SARS. Lockdowns didn't work. All the things that they knew didn't work in 2002, they did it now. And they knew that the lab was an issue, the containments were an issue, there were problems and all of these things. They knew all of this. And yet they went ahead and implemented everything that they knew was wrong. They knew that things spread through the aerosolization from the having the bathroom fans, creating the negative pressure. They had dried out P-traps and so forth, and things were being sucked up through the drainage into the air. Like, I'm sorry, I don't care what it is. Sewage is toxic. You don't need to be breathing that in. So if you're going to have that, people are going to get sick, right? And they know these things, but they're recommending people to do these things. And I'm like, really? It's like, you know all these things are wrong, and they're like, oh, I don't know. Well, you're lying, because the WHO and the CDC both knew about this. So this was deliberate. Like, I have no mercy for these guys. They knew what they were doing. Yeah, the idiots that might be out front that you see may not, but a lot of them did. And yes, Fauci and these other guys, they're just the fall guys to protect the other guys.
Right.
100%.
Agreed. Well said.
Yes. As we're going to be wrapping up here, what do you want to say to people? Like, here's your 2 minutes on the soapbox.
I would say, unfortunately, that the powers that be are not going to tell us what happened. And if you're interested in knowing what actually happened, I would continue to watch shows like this. And if anything of what I've said resonates with you, to visit jonfleetwood.com. That's Jon, no H, and then Fleetwood, like Fleetwood Mac, jonfleetwood.com. They can check me out on Twitter X at Jon M, as in Michael, Jon M Fleetwood. But if you just go into Twitter X and type Jon Fleetwood in the search bar, you'll be able to find me. And then on Instagram, I'm also there at Real Jon Fleetwood. But the best way people can get my newsletter, where I give them these Substack posts that are bullets, not buckshot, no hyperbole, or at least no invented hyperbole. I just find the documents that are naturally hyperbolic and give them to you, and actually try to give you an understanding of what actually went on in the whole COVID-19 phenomenon.
Yes, and I mean, give him a follow. His links and so forth, they're in the descriptions if you're watching on Rumble and YouTube and Facebook. So check out what he has to say, because I mean, I started following you on X recently, and I liked what you had to say, and I was looking more through the stuff that you were putting out, and I agree with a lot of it. There's a lot of lies that are going on. There's a lot of half-truths that are going on, and like I've always said from the beginning, until you slap the cuffs on people and start hauling them out and looking in exactly what they were doing, we're not going to know the truth, and we have a right to know the truth. And it doesn't matter whether or not something is completely true on what gets the investigation going. The fact that they are shown with some indiscretions, we just need that ability to get in there to find out what was going on, because they're going to lie to us until we actually have the evidence ourselves, and that's just the bottom. So I'm gonna close here with a prayer, and thank you guys all for coming. Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your love, your grace, your mercy. We thank you for the hope that you have given us. And Lord, we look at the situation that we're living in and help that the truth would come out, and help the work that Jon is doing and others like him that are trying to find out the truth and to do what is right for the people. And Father, help the men and the women to come together to rebuild our families, our churches, our community, our nation, and help us to get some protection from this wickedness, especially the children who need it the most, until we see you coming in the clouds, is my prayer. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.